Welcome everybody. My name is Paul Bramadat. I'm actually the director of a different research center. It's called the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. I'm sort of the guest moderator of this evening's discussion, largely because this allows Martin Bunton, who's the actual director of the Center for Global Studies, to add some richer content. I can't offer a whole lot of content to this particular conversation. I'm simply here to make things, to sort of stir things up a little bit. So I'm very pleased to be invited to be the moderator. It's been a great opportunity to work with Martin and Jody on this project. So some of you may know that this event this evening is part of IdeaFest 2015. IdeaFest is an opportunity for the university's research centers and departments and major projects to kind of give a bit of a showcase of what we're up to at the university. And so we pick projects and ideas and themes that allow us to kind of showcase the researchers and the graduate students at the university, but also to make sure that there's a place for public conversation. So the Center for Global Studies is committed to fostering reflection on the complex array of social forces associated with an increasingly interconnected world characterized by new forms of economic activity, artistic production, politics, media, nationalism, ethnicity, spirituality, and community that increasingly transcend local, national, and regional boundaries. The center is the hub at UVic for conversations and research projects that tackle some of the world's most interesting and difficult problems, from challenges to international borders, to changes in global fish stocks, to environmental crises, to upheavals in Eastern Europe, to list just a few of the issues that have engaged the research fellows at the center in recent memory. The CFGS is also an ideal host of a conversation about ISIS and our country's response to ISIS, since several of the center's fellows and friends have been deeply immersed in thinking, reading, teaching, or writing about what is clearly a crisis in international security and Canadian foreign policy, or is at least experienced and framed that way by many people in the country. Although I direct another research center, as I mentioned, I'm here as a moderator partially because I work on the question of radicalization and securitization, and also because it is arguably impossible, or at least not such a good idea, to talk about ISIS or simply the Islamic State without talking about Islam or Islamism, or as Stephen Harper said, Islamicism, because as Prime Minister he gets to just invent new words. And because I've been working for years on the question of what people are talking about when they're talking about religion, especially certain kinds of religion that are framed as problems to certain kinds of states. So IdeaFest events are typically designed not just to show off the research acumen of UVic faculty and students, but to create a discussion among the broader public. As such, we've asked our speakers to speak to different dimensions of the nature, emergence, social construction, and political response to ISIS, but we've also asked them to keep their comments brief, so that we can leave quite a bit of time for a moderated public discussion at the end. We'll have about 40 or so minutes if everybody acts like law-abiding citizens. These four, I mean, I trust you'll all be fine, but these four I know pretty well, and I'm a little bit worried. After each speaker shares his thoughts, I will pose a pointed question to open the comments up for further investigation. And then we're going to have, and first we'll have two of these brief talks, and then we will take a brief commercial break to bear witness to a recent production of our very own Prime Minister's office on the question of ISIS and what it represents. This is to sort of kind of a palate cleanser, or to kind of, you know, keep your brain hopping along and kind of open you up to what is going to follow, which is two more talks. And then we'll have 40 minutes for open conversation, which I will lightly moderate. And about that conversation, our expectation is that you will feel welcome to share your perspectives openly, and we just ask you to respect the normal guidelines for polite and constructive conversation. That's not to say that you have to be nice if being nice isn't something your mother taught you, but we do ask you to try to see this evening as an opportunity to both speak and to listen. And so without further ado, I want to tell you a little bit about our four speakers. I'm going to introduce them in order of that they're going to be speaking, and then I will try to get out of the way to let them speak. So our first speaker is Martin Bunton, who is the acting director of the Center for Global Studies. He's taking over for Oliver Schmidtka, who's on leave at the moment, and he's an associate professor in history. Dr. Bunton teaches in the field of modern Middle Eastern history, focusing on the history of the region in its global context. Andrew Rippin is Professor Emeritus of Islamic History at UVic and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. Scott Watson received his PhD from UBC and joined the University of Victoria's Department of Political Science that same year. He's currently Associate Professor and Graduate Advisor in Poli-Sci. Dr. Watson's research interests address the construction of security threats and conditions of insecurity. He is particularly interested in the nexus between state discourses of danger and humanitarian impulses to assist in response to forced migration and disasters. And finally, Andrew Wender is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Political Science and History and within the Religious Studies program here at UVic. Dr. Wender's research focuses on historical and contemporary intersections of religion and politics in the Middle East, as well as political theory and modern world history. So, that's all for me for now. Please join me in welcoming Martin Bunton.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for taking this on, and thank you everybody for coming. So I have two main points I'd like to make, and I will make them at the outset. I will pose them as propositions. Perhaps they really belong as conclusions, but if I say it now, it'll come out clearly before Paul so politely shuts me down. The two propositions are closely related, but I think they're worth considering separately. The first proposition is that ISIS, as we know it, is less a problem in and of itself than it is a symptom of larger problems. And those larger problems of which it is a symptom is the failed states of Iraq and Syria. I'll say more about all this in a moment, but the point that needs to be made at the outset is that the reason for the swift and dramatic expansion of ISIS, as pictured above, over the eastern third of Syria and the western third of Iraq, is that it was made possible by the breakdown of state structures in Iraq and Syria. I would further propose, therefore, that the response needs primarily to be a political diplomatic one that addresses these larger issues than a military one focused on ISIS. So my second related proposition, and maybe I'm making the same point and spinning it a different way, but I'll elaborate, is that any confidence that one can have right at the moment that somehow by unleashing military force you can guide it towards a desired political goal. Not only does this idea have very little evidentiary support, and certainly I think the recent military interventions to topple regimes in the Middle East, whether that be in Afghanistan, Libya, or Iraq itself, caution against this idea. But in fact, that such military force risks creating a backlash that will exacerbate the unstable political conditions that provide the fertile ground for ISIS to build support, as well as potentially lead to a much more protracted campaign that could lead to ever more lives being destroyed. So those really are my two main points. Everything else kind of is going to be filler in efforts to support this. In the briefest terms, the expansion and consolidation of ISIS have mostly been in areas of Iraq and Syria that are primarily Sunni Muslim. It is a marginalization and alienation of these disaffected Sunni populations, the sense of betrayal in Syria since the onset of the civil war in 2011, and the dispossession of Sunnis in Iraq following the 2003 American invasion. In an increasingly violent, insecure, polarized situation, this is what explains the support that the Sunni Muslims of Syria and Iraq have given to ISIS, whom they have come to see as protecting their interests when no one else is. How has this come about? The story, the historical perspective that I want to give, really only dates back to 2003 and the American invasion of the country that toppled Saddam Hussein following 9/11 as part of the America's war on terrorism. A swift military victory, to be sure, but the U.S. failed miserably to prepare politically for the post-war situation. And the magnitude of that failure is very well reflected in the constant descent into chaos and insecurity following the invasion. The 2003 American occupation created a climate of impunity that took the country on a descent into chaos, and this was a very fertile ground in which Al-Qaeda was able to expand. So to take a moment here just to suggest the extent to which all of this arguably was fully in line with what Al-Qaeda strategists were thinking. You provoke the United States, 9/11, into taking reprisals, an invasion and occupation of a large, important Middle Eastern country, Arab country in the middle of the Middle East, so as to create the conditions on their terms for a jihad against infidels and crusaders. Al-Qaeda jumps into the power vacuum of Iraq, a country devoid now of governance, and they proceed to gain adherents and followers, largely from the Sunni Muslims, who were purged from the government offices by the Americans after 2003, and then form the background of the resistance to the American occupation. And by definition, every military occupation will breed its own resistance. However, and this is a really important point, I think, that this marriage of convenience between Sunni leaders in Iraq and al-Qaeda jihadis could not survive the savagery of al-Qaeda violence. Al-Qaeda in Iraq overreached. By 2007, 2008, Sunni leaders in Iraq turned against the al-Qaeda cells working in their midst. Seriously weakened, once Iraqi Sunnis had turned against them, al-Qaeda, though, was then given a new lease in life in 2011, 2012, by the vicious war in Syria, when President Assad turns against the moderate opposition forces and seeks to crush them. Now, at this point, an offshoot of al-Qaeda in Iraq sets up shop in Syria under the leadership of al-Baghdadi. They are able to launch operations in Syria as the civil war there intensifies, and then they use these bases in 2013 and 2014. They use these bases in Syria as a launching pad back into northern or western Iraq. And the reason they were able to make such lightning strikes back into northern Iraq is the fact that from 2008 until 2014, the al-Maliki government in Baghdad operated a very pro-Shia government, reliant more on Shia militias and Shia fiefdoms, and did not incorporate the Sunnis of Iraq into any serious power-sharing arrangement. So it had alienated, again, the Sunni population of Iraq. To give you one important for instance in all of this, one of the most important or significant consequences of the very fractious and corrupt regime that al-Maliki was operating in Baghdad is the complete ineptitude of their military. So that a military that was armed by hundreds of thousands in Iraq, armed with some of the top American equipment, it withers away in Mosul when faced with the determined and efficient and terrifying, chillingly terrifying forces of ISIS, which number in the tens of thousands. Okay. When from 2012 to 2014, ISIS was able to take control of cities of first Raqqa in Syria and then Mosul in Iraq, it then becomes one of the best equipped, best funded militias. Of course, it doesn't hurt that they find oil wells along the way, scoring the most impressive military victories of all of the militias fighting in the region at this time, and posting sophisticated videos on the web. As a consequence, foreign fighters start flocking to Syria to join it. Perhaps most importantly, ISIS starts to attract fighters from the moderate forces that had been fighting against Assad, as the fighters back the winner with stronger leadership strategies and better armed. Their expansion, however, stops. ISIS expansion stops when they come up against the Peshmerga forces of the Kurdish areas and the sometimes equally fierce militias of the Shia areas around Baghdad. And now we have something of a stalemate. A stalemate in which, apart from consolidating their position among the Sunnis in Iraq, and this will not be that straightforward for ISIS to do, they will be able to some extent, should they be able to provide the services, the day-to-day services that the Baghdad government wasn't able to survive, then perhaps they're in a position to consolidate this. But it doesn't look like they're able to do that. They may be a very wealthy militia, but it's running a very poor state. And if you think, too, of the extent to which this really is a marriage of convenience, it's largely thanks to the secular Ba'athist Sunni officials from Saddam Hussein's regime, a regime which fought fiercely against the Islamists, such as ISIS. But they're the ones who are now providing a lot of the important strategies and leadership of ISIS. But it is very much an odd pairing. And by all accounts, ISIS is running all sorts of mafia-like extraction rackets, too, in their midst. So at the same time as trying to consolidate their position, in western Syria, eastern Syria, western Iraq, they also seem to be calculating that a provocation of outside powers will help them in this. Perhaps a similar calculation to Al-Qaeda 12, 13 years ago. You provoke a reaction by outside forces, lure them into the battle on their terrain. Okay, start to wrap this up, thanks. They will, of course, be building their own narrative, that they alone are the ones to protect the disenfranchised Sunnis of Iraq and Syria. That it is the Western Crusader infidels, those who fight alongside as allies with the Shia militias, some of whom are equally fierce as ISIS. And what we may well see acts of vengeance by the Shia militias as they start to take over territories that were controlled by ISIS that parallel. They may not be YouTubed, they may not be videoed, but they could very well parallel the butchery of ISIS over the last year. Or they will be fighting alongside Assad's regime, Alawite regime in Syria. This is the material that the ISIS will be using to build support. And I'll wrap up here, what needs to be done is to build a counter-narrative, right? To build a possibility of a new political fabric that will draw in the mainstream Sunni leaders in these areas into a political framework in which they feel that they can participate and have their interests properly secured. If it is the political conditions, economic conditions that give rise to a situation in which ISIS can flourish, then I suppose I'm suggesting that it's the rebuilding of the political and economic fabric of these states that will contribute to their end. Thank you.
So one very simple, quick follow-up question that I think you can answer in 30 seconds, I'm sure. ISIS frames itself as sort of not really caring about the borders between many of these states, which it sees somewhat correctly as being imposed by imperial forces.
Right. Do
you think that what you're witnessing is going to lead to the redrawing of the borders of Iraq and Syria?
A very good question. So that exactly is what ISIS would like us to believe, of course, that they are erasing these colonially drawn borders. There's a slick video out there that says we're tearing up the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 100 years ago, whereby European powers did divide up the Middle East into these artificial contrived borders, right? And even the name change, my understanding is they go from the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria to the Islamic State, right, to suggest that there is no Iraq and Syria anymore, right? And so there's some truth to this, but I think it is much more complex for a couple of reasons. One is that the European division of these areas, it did happen 100 years ago, so we're looking at multiple generations of people who are growing up, studying curriculum or fighting wars on behalf of, etc., Iraq and Syria. So there are these identities around Iraq and Syria that need to be taken into account. It's also, I think, fair to say that the alternative, to suggest that Iraq and Syria is somehow a foreign imposition and that the real identities out there are the Kurdish and the Sunni and the Shia ones, that doesn't play out over the course of the whole 20th century. There are some who suggest that those identities were in large part fabricated by the imperial governments who sought avenues of divide and rule, right? And we'll hear more of this. At various times in the 50s and 60s, categories like peasant and landlord were much more important in understanding Iraqi politics than Shia and Sunni. Okay, having said that, it's hard to imagine after the savagery of the last, in Iraq since 2003, that any community in Iraq would accept being led by another community from Baghdad. So I'd argue that there's the borders between Iraq and Syria may stay the same, but Sunnis in Iraq will achieve more and more autonomy. Certainly the Kurds, who already have a fair bit of autonomy, may well achieve more independence. And perhaps the same would go in Syria as well, where these communities achieve, where there could be a drawing of more significant borders within the two states.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next up is Andrew Rippin.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure, of course, to be here and to welcome all of you. When I agreed to do this topic 3 or 4 months ago, and came up with this sort of topic, it seemed like a good opportunity to be able to give some historical and religious kind of context to a discussion about ISIS. But in the last couple of weeks, of course, this has become, my topic has become a particular area of controversy, with a wide kind of reaction of people thinking that perhaps it's better not to use the word Islam when referring to ISIS, and others who talk about ISIS as being very Islamic. So you get the entire sort of range of controversy which is going on in public and academic discussions today on this particular topic. So I do want to be clear about what it is I'm trying to suggest here. Certainly, ISIS is, at best, an interpretation of Islam. Where I think the mistake comes about is to think that ISIS is somehow a more authentic version of Islam because it uses these kinds of Islamic resonances which I'm going to be talking about. In fact, the point I would want to make and what differentiates ISIS from what we might call that sort of authentic vision of Islam, if such a thing exists, would be to emphasize that ISIS uses these historical resonances in a very modern way that emerges out of its political and social context. Now, another way of putting that would be to say that certainly the appeal to Muslim principles is an important part of ISIS's platform, but that shouldn't be mistaken for saying that Islamic principles drive the actions of ISIS. The history of Islam is vast, and it's always possible to pick out elements that will serve to support and justify or motivate actions that fit the pragmatic goals. So what I'm going to do in the few minutes allocated to me is pay attention to some words and images used by ISIS. My primary goal will be to explain why they're significant to the group and the context in which the fighting's taking place. I do want to show how ISIS appeals to Islamic notions in order to support their political and social agenda. Now, my attention to this is necessarily limited. I can't cover every aspect of it. So I thought this particular picture might be a useful way of starting. It was a picture which got tweeted around the world in many occasions, primarily because it soon became clear that this box which this young man is holding has been relabeled. It was a UN refugee supply box, which was then relabeled with an ISIS label, in that sense, in order to take credit for it. And across the bottom, it says that it refers to what this boy is doing, and that's the distribution of charities, zakat, to a refugee camp in the village of Kurmuz Ali, which is near Dar al-Fat, which is what it says in the circle there, and that's likely in Syria somewhere. So what I want to do, essentially, is is explicate each of these pieces on this sticker. And the first part is Dawlat al-Islamiyya, what we translate as the Islamic State. This is an interesting usage in and by itself. Now, Dawla is used as a name for countries, other countries in the Middle East, Kuwait and Qatar for two. Although most popular are to call countries republics, Jumhuriya or kingdom, Mamlukiya or Mamlaka. But a dawla has particular resonances, partially because it refers in history to the dynasties of caliphs, so that the caliphs in early period of Islam, in a dynastic kind of succession from father to son usually, would get called that. But also, and perhaps more significantly if one thinks about it, that the kind of literal sense of dawla is something which turns. It comes from that sense of turning. And in fact, it's often used in the sense that it's a turn for success. And one of the things that this name might convey in that kind of broader context is this sense in which this actually means that the name of this area is, this is Islam's turn for success. And one of the problems then which emerges is if we start translating a dawla here as state, we get these kinds of conceptions of what a modern state is all about, which isn't in fact perhaps what the Islamic State wishes to convey. The other point about this would be to point out, as Martin mentioned as well, that of course the Islamic State has been through various changes of name, and this is where it used to be called Dawlat al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Shams, which is where this ISIS or ISIL comes from, and also where the modern acronym Daesh comes from, used as an acronym from the Arabic for that full name. One of the interesting things about using Daesh, of course, is that you then avoid actually saying the word Islam in relationship to the Islamic State. So it definitely has that kind of importance. The next piece here, there, that piece, says Diwan al-Zakat, which is another interesting kind of phrase, in that it means office of charity. Diwan is an interesting word to use too because of its historical resonances. Most modern governments would use wazira for an office or a ministry of something, but rather this is a diwan. And the importance here is to recognize that the establishment of this diwan is an important part, or is seen to be an important part of the development of this dawla, of the Islamic State. And in fact, its attempt to try and demonstrate that it is a functioning state, that is, that its role in providing social services is a central part of what it does. And this is also, as I might have occasion to say later, an important part in revolutionary theory which lies behind the Islamic State. It has to get to that point of actually being able to administer social services. And this picture here is a page from a booklet which IS produced, which talks about its social services, its observance of markets and those sorts of things in order to keep control of what's going on. Now, the next important word here is Khilafah, and the word for caliphate. And we hear a lot about that, of course. The caliphate was established in the Islamic world after the death of Muhammad, abolished in 1924 in Turkey with the sultans. The idea here is definitely an important Islamic one. But it goes a little bit further in the Islamic State's use of it. In this phrase over the side here, manhaj al-nubuwah, what gets translated as according to the prophetic method. And this phrase, which is rather an odd phrase in many ways, and has come to some recent prominence because of the Islamic State, in origin comes from a report, what's called a tradition, a hadith, found in one of the books of traditions in Islam, which talks about a prophecy of Muhammad, who talks about a series of governments which will come into place after he is gone. First, there will be a caliphate according to the prophetic method, and that's understood usually to be the first 4 caliphs. And that will last as long as God allows it to, and then it will be taken away. And then there will be a hypocritical monarchy, and that will be taken away. And then there will be tyrannical monarchy, and that will last as long as God allows. And then there will be a caliphate in accordance with the prophetic method. And so ISIS is picking up on that prophetic sense of what the caliphate is all about. Now, the final thing is what in fact has become quite famous as the flag of ISIS. And here one sees a larger version of the same thing in an older form, because you'll notice, if you can read the Arabic, that it's the older name of the Islamic State. It says in Iraq and Syria across the bottom. Now, of course, this has the Muslim Shahada, the testimony of faith, across the top. There is no God but God. What it has as a significant element, though, is this, what is described as a seal in the middle. For those of you who do read Arabic, you realize this is rather odd, because one must read it from bottom to top rather than what would be the normal Arabic way of reading it from top to bottom. But it does simply say that Muhammad is the messenger of God. This is understood to be a ring which the early caliphs wore, and it was then lost at one point in history in early times, which was, the reports about it are symbolic. It's a loss. It means the loss of authority. It was refound, apparently, in the 16th century and taken to Topkapi Palace in Istanbul as a relic of Muhammad. And this then becomes the signet ring of a relic, which is then taken over, but to give it all that certain sense of the prophetic background to the state itself. Now, one final point which, moving away from that particular picture, is what has become a very famous propaganda magazine of the Islamic State, one called UVic. And according to, once again, to various reports which come about, UVic is an important place on what is essentially today the border between Syria and Turkey, where there will be where it is talked about the final battles at the end of the world will take place. Islamic State in this kind of propaganda is deeply motivated, it would seem, or deeply wishes to push this kind of apocalyptic ending to the world. In this particular picture, the final crusade, that is both the crusade which will be launched against the Islamic State, but then the retaliation for it as well, which will be seen to bring about the end of the world. And this is the inside cover of one of the issues. And circled up in the top there is a quote from Zarqawi, one of the important leaders from Iraq early on who was killed. The spark has been lit here in Iraq, and its heat will continue to intensify by God's permission until it burns the Crusader armies in UVic. It's interesting also that UVic was a place where there was a decisive battle between the Ottomans and the Mamluks back in 1516. It's a place that has always had that kind of resonances. So in order to wrap up, it's difficult to wrap up, but one might say that in thinking about foreign interventions, ways of trying to control the Islamic State and its warfare, then one does need to take into account the challenges in dealing with an apocalyptic movement of the wanting to avoid, in a certain sense, a self-fulfilling prophecy that the people who are embarking on this are actually eager to see than the apocalypse brought on. But with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Stay at the microphone for just a moment. Just a very brief question. You've given us a brief and yet I think deep reading of some kind of key concepts in Arabic terms that one finds in the rhetoric of ISIS and the rhetoric about ISIS. I noticed you didn't mention the other concept that one often hears, which is jihad. And I wonder if you can reflect on the way in which that term is taken up by them or against them.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I didn't is because I think it's one of those places where, to me at least, the sort of Islamic resonances have fallen well behind. It's become simply a word for struggle. And it's been overtaken by this kind of revolutionary ideology. So what jihad is no longer the Muslim holy war, but is indeed revolutionary theory, which some see as deeply influenced by Maoist ideas. That is, that there is an idea of revolution where one intentionally creates chaos and how one intentionally uses brutality in order to make people feel so desperate that they are willing to accept a certain building in civil order. And in fact, there's a book, an Arabic book, which was published in 2004, which seems to be the blueprint for this kind of revolutionary movement. Is called Idar al-Tawahush, the management of slavery. And this sets out this kind of revolutionary pattern of the way in which instability will be produced in order to overthrow everything. And there's another part which comes in, interesting enough, I don't know a great deal about this, but in American military strategists of some sorts, the importance put upon the use of social media, of information networks and so forth, as a part of military strategy. And this too, the Islamic State seems to have adopted. Because I would add that this revolutionary theory, I think this is one of the things which Muslims particularly react strongly against. That this really does violate every principle that Muslims would feel was central to Islam. Muslims may feel that the goal of establishing a caliphate is a good one, but to do so through revolutionary activities that end up harming many people, including, and in fact mainly, fellow Muslims, is against any sense of upholding public interest, which would be seen as central to what Islam stands for. And that's what really separates the Islamic State from most other, in fact, what we might call jihadi movements.
Thank you. Now let's see if this works.
ISIL has established a self-proclaimed caliphate, at present stretching over a vast territory roughly from Aleppo to near Baghdad, from which it intends to launch a terrorist jihad not merely against the region, but on a global basis. Indeed, it has specifically targeted Canada and Canadians, urging supporters to attack, quote, disbelieving Canadians in any manner, vowing that we should not feel secure even in our homes. For all of us who are blessed to live in a country like this, it is hard to appreciate and understand the fact how we can have people who so despise and are involved in a movement, who so want violence, who so despise modernity, who so hate progress, that they can desire to drive out medical workers from their community, harm them, how they can enslave women, work for children, how they can want to kill anyone who looks or thinks different. It is, in a sense, Mr. Speaker, beyond our comprehension, but it is very real. And in this struggle in which we are engaged, in which not only our finest values must be pushed to work, so must be and will be the highest unity and resolve. They are our ultimate and indispensable weapons, and that's what these people face.
This will lead us to strengthen our resolve and redouble our efforts and those of our national security agencies to take all necessary steps to identify and counter threats and keep Canada safe and free. Just as it will lead us to strengthen our resolve and redouble our efforts to work with our allies around the world and fight against the terrorist organization who brutalize those in other countries with the hope of bringing their savagery to our shores. They will have no safety. When a trio of hooded men struck at some of our most cherished democratic principles, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, they assaulted democracy everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world, cities across this country, openly demonstrated that we will not be intimidated by the Protestant terrorists. I know all Canadians during this time of national mourning, we all stand together with the people of France. Let there be no misunderstanding. We will not be intimidated. Canada will remember.
Yeah. With that, right. I'm going to redouble my efforts to not say anything nasty. That means quadruple my efforts. Scott. Oh yeah, it's not on the video. Get the sound. You can just watch it again. Okay.
Very good, thank you. And the video is a perfect introduction to what I want to talk about, which is the Canadian response. And I would put it forward in terms of thinking about the response on two fronts. The first is Canada's participation in the military campaign in Iraq and Syria, but also its response domestically through Bill C-51 and the anti-terrorism legislation. And I want to talk about both of those things very quickly. Of course, we have limited time, but the focus that I take is through securitization, which is more or less an academic term, perhaps an unnecessary term, to think about how issues are presented or understood as a threat, with a particular focus on the type of issues or the type of responses that we should be taking. And in this case, and the video nicely highlights that, the predominance of military imagery in the video in many ways demonstrates the connection that the government wants to make, which is between the ISIS threat and a Canadian military response, which is nicely highlighted there. The other connections that are highlighted through that video but are consistently portrayed in both the media and by the government is a connection between ISIS and what's going on in Iraq and Syria with various developments within Canada, targeting of military officers in Ottawa. The shootings in Ottawa in particular are highlighted as direct connections. Also, the inference to the Charlie Hebdo shootings are also directly connected. So what the government is doing then is linking these various elements together to present a coherent narrative of threat and to justify particular policy responses. And I want to focus on two of those, but what's important to remember in this is, as any securitizing actor presents a response, as the appropriate response, they are, as Martin alluded to, they are presenting these policies as known solutions, as if they can demonstrate they know the outcome, that the proper way to respond is through a military response, and we know what the outcome will be. It will be a defeat of ISIS. Or we will implement anti-terrorism legislation, and we know what the response will be. It will prevent domestic acts of terror. Even though I would suggest the evidence suggests that both of those claims to knowledge are highly problematic. Well, I'll focus on the two in turn. The first is Canada's response in Iraq and Syria. And if you were reading the newspaper at all today, you will note that another significant development, and that Canada's foreign minister has in essence announced an extension of Canada's mission. The original intention was that Canada would be participating until April 7th, but today announced that they envision a much longer participation in Iraq and Syria. It is left undefined as to how long it will be, and Canada's role is also left undefined. As to what exactly we will be doing there is not entirely clear. And as is demonstrated also by the video, the only thing that we know is that a military response is needed and necessary according to this threat narrative. But what exactly the Canadian military is doing and how it will lead to security in the Middle East is not clearly enunciated, right? It's simply, here's a threat, and here's the appropriate military response. We know that currently there are 69 Canadian military professionals in Iraq and Syria, approximately 10 Canadian planes of various sorts that are operating there, doing bombing runs and also liaising with local actors to bring about defeat of ISIS. And some of the actors we're engaging with, including some of the Kurdish Peshmerga, but other actors on the ground. And without casting aspersions onto the actors that we're working with, because we, as Canadians, we actually don't know who we are working with, we've seen these types of interactions have negative effects previously. We know that American interventions in certain areas involved working with actors that later on became Al-Qaeda, for instance. And so when you have a military liaising with unknown actors that appear to be allies for at least temporary purposes, we don't know what that outcome will be. Despite assurances from the government that a military response is appropriate, the types of things we're doing, who we're working with, who we might be arming and training, I would suggest is beyond our knowledge to know what the eventual outcome of that will be. But as Nicholson stated today, that will be ongoing, and the analogy that he drew is Canada's participation in Afghanistan, which was about a 12-year commitment. So it looks like this will be a long-term commitment, but as yet undefined from our government. So we have the action in Iraq and Syria, but the other thing I want to focus on is the response within Canada, the second front of that war against ISIS, which is Bill C-51, the Anti-Terrorism Act, which is currently before Parliament. And again, if you've been following the news and some of the controversy, you will know that this is in fact a highly controversial piece of legislation for what it does. It drastically expands the power of CSIS, and it changes the original mandate of CSIS, giving it much greater power than it has previously. And I can't go through the whole list. We don't have time actually to go through all the things that are problematic in that piece of legislation. So I want to highlight a couple while I still have time. The first is the creation of new crime against promoting terrorism, which is largely left undefined beyond that, such that it's not clear what types of speech would actually entail inciting terrorism. You could have this type of a get-together where we might talk about people going to support the anti-ISIS forces on the ground, but it's not clear in this legislation whether that would qualify as inciting terror. If one were to encourage someone, let's say, to support the Kurds, for instance, well, in some cases, Kurdish groups are labeled as terrorists, and so again, you can get into difficulty when you have a piece of legislation that creates a very broad notion of a crime of inciting terror without clearly defining it in the way that it has. The second problem is oversight of CSIS's new power. The current oversight body in Canadian legislation is the Security Intelligence Review Committee. This is a committee that has been underfunded and whose funding has been cut progressively over the previous decade. It is understaffed and it no longer has the capacity already to deal with the various complaints that have been launched against CSIS. And now we are drastically increasing CSIS's power and their ability to violate the Charter and certain laws at the same time as we are reducing the one body that is empowered to actually oversee what CSIS is doing. And so we have this potentially disastrous outcome where we have this expanded role for CSIS and no one overseeing it. And this has been the focus of some of the criticism of that piece of legislation. The third thing that I'll highlight, because I know I'm short on time, is who may be included as part of these extremist groups. And we have two instances where we know that members of the government have affiliated environmental activists and First Nations group with potential extremists in Canada. And what you have then is the possibility of these groups falling under this new anti-terror legislation, which in its name, as it's introduced in Parliament to fight ISIS, can actually be used as a tool to quash protest that occurs within Canada that has absolutely nothing to do with ISIS, that may in fact have to do with pipelines being built or fighting over treaty recognition in British Columbia. So this expanse of law has profound implications beyond Canada's fight against ISIS, which I would argue is dangerous. I know we're very short on time. The last thing I would highlight is that a securitization approach also focuses attention on why political actors want to securitize, why they want to label something as a security threat. And I don't think we should overlook the fact that we are entering an election year in which it's going to be hotly contested. And if the issue of terrorism and playing up the images that we saw, the Ottawa attack, the bravery of Vickers in shooting the person who attacked Ottawa, using this imagery to demonstrate one political party as being fighting terrorism and the other party's weak, I think we need to be aware of the fact that this is playing into an upcoming election with a government that can use anti-terrorism as a means, as an issue to address the Canadian public. Thank you.
One question just to sort of build on what you're saying, I think. On the one hand, there are people who think that really the only thing we're talking about politically is ISIS, that all ISIS all the time, and they would justify any expansion of CSIS's powers to stop that thing. And then there are folks on the other side of the spectrum who say, look, this is a complete fabrication, this is a complete media construction, these people are ragtag, they're minor, they're never going to be a real threat to us in Victoria. So on these, there's sort of two extremes. How do you assess the actual threat posed by ISIS to Canada?
Yeah. That's the difficulty, is that to take an approach that simply wants to examine how something is constructed as threatening doesn't necessarily answer, I think, the very important question of, well, then how should we respond? A flippant way to respond is to retreat to an objective type position and say, let's just look at the objective factors, the objective things that will affect Canadians. And we know that in the next coming year, and in previous years, more Canadians will die from moose and bee stings and home improvement accidents than will die from terrorist incidents. And so one response has been, well, let's just look at the causes of Canadian mortality. I think that's a flippant response and doesn't necessarily get at what is a real political issue, although it does put it in a nice juxtaposition to how we think about the things that we should be paying attention to. So I think my response to that is simply to say it calls for a thoughtful, measured response that is not laden with security rhetoric, which requires us to engage with, as we're doing tonight, the causes of what's going on there, and how anti-terrorism legislation might affect Canadians within Canada. It forces us to look at the regional context. It forces us to look at previous instances of intervention and the outcomes of those interventions. And while it might not necessarily tell us Canada should cease operations there within the next 2 weeks, because I simply don't have those firm answers, I think it simply asks us to engage with a particular process of thinking about these questions and questioning those who would implement hastily and unexamined policy responses in the name of security. And I'll leave it there.
Our last speaker this evening is Andrew Winder, and I'm thinking that someone should write a letter to CSIS to get them to go after the moose.
First, thank you so much for including me tonight, and thank you so much for coming. So, with our having just watched the Prime Minister's statement condemning ISIS as the mortal enemy of modernity and progress, I'd like to begin by asserting that there are, in fact, few claims as problematic as the now familiar refrain that ISIS embodies a resurgent form of medieval barbarism that threatens and must be vanquished by modern civilization. Putting aside the unfortunate denigration of medievalism, a caricature that one might have hoped to be put to rest no later than Charles Homer Haskins' classic 1920s description of a 12th century Renaissance, and also forgetting for the moment the unquestioning but inadvisable idolizing of modernity, the point is that ISIS is about as paradigmatically modern a phenomenon as one might imagine. From its social media broadcast apocalyptic utopianism to its desire to erase and surge across the artificial nation-state boundaries whose colonial creation helped establish the conditions for its existence, ISIS is nothing so much as a creature of transnational globalization, together with the fragile states and inflamed intercommunal hostilities left in globalization's wake. So, in my few minutes, I'd like to emphasize how ISIS is in significant part fed by seeming antipathies among particular configurations of Sunni, Shia, Kurds, and other religious and ethnic communities, hatreds that have been immeasurably worsened, if not fabricated, by a long, but especially modern history, a painful present, and a likely unfortunate future of foreign interventions and strategic manipulations. Now, I don't mean to claim that there is no such thing as, say, a real denominational divide between Sunni and Shia, rooted in struggles over spiritual and political authority within early Islamic history, struggles which bear, for that matter, intimate connectivity to the areas now known as Iraq and Syria. However, well-known global patterns of colonial divide and conquer strategies employed from Latin America and all around eastward to the Pacific Rim have helped to carve profound scars within the Middle East that ISIS and other of today's self-interested intervening actors, for ISIS can be viewed as yet another foreign interventionist, work to deepen and infect. One could easily start long before the 20th century by drawing attention not merely to Western empires such as Britain and France, but of course also their rivals like Russia and the Ottomans. However, given the stress that, as Martin spoke about, that ISIS itself lays on eradicating the 1916 Sykes-Picot borders, enshrining Western colonial designs over the Middle East, perhaps this is as salient a landmark to pinpoint as any. Of course, some might say that the Islamic State's propagandistic claim is inaccurate, because once the Great War ended, that secret agreement among the British, French, Italians, and Romanov Russia was superseded by quite different League of Nations mandate boundaries, which, if anything, gave Britain and France even more direct and expansive control over newly invented territorial prototypes of present-day Syria and Iraq. Whatever the case, the 1920s saw France cleave that which thwarted post-war Syrian nationalists had envisioned as Greater Syria into two portions. Lebanon, a Mediterranean enclave disproportionately dominated by Maronite Christians closely associated with Paris, and Syria, in which the Sunni Arab majority was kept off balance by France's granting a special influence in local administration to minorities, such as the Bashar al-Assad's family's previously disadvantaged Alawi forebears. Alawis comprising an offshoot of Shiism, but one that, as a syncretic admixture with other faiths, is viewed heretically by some Shia as well as Sunnis. As for the British, not only did they cut western and eastern Palestine, the latter soon to be renamed Transjordan, off of southern Greater Syria, they further claimed a Mesopotamian, that is Iraqi prize, in which southern Shia and northern Kurds, as well as central Sunnis, were placed under the rule of an implanted Sunni monarch, Faisal. Faisal's sovereignty owed largely to Winston Churchill's belief that he would be subject to effective manipulation, as well as consolation for his having just previously been turned out of Damascus by the French. Following Syria's post-World War II independence and Iraq's transition from 1930s constitutional monarchy to what Iraqi nationalist narratives have tended to view as true independence when the monarchy was overthrown in 1958, it is difficult to think of periods when the countries have not been buffeted by interventionism. Further, each country has itself acted as an interventionist power in ways where the resultant worsening of intercommunal divides manifests in the rise of and reactions against ISIS. Thus, during the period that Syria served as a key strategic asset and ideological protege of the Soviets during the Cold War, Bashar al-Assad's father Hafez began Syria's 30-year run as a power broker for Shi'i interests in strife-torn Lebanon, while also crushing Sunni uprisings at home. Shi'i Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979 and subsequent pivotal role in helping to create and sponsor the Shi'i movement Hezbollah following Israel's 1982 invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon suggest why Iran and Hezbollah remain as the Assad regime's preeminent regional backers and as implacable foes of ISIS. By contrast, support on the Syrian battlefield from, above all, Saudi Arabia and Qatar as Tehran's Sunni rivals in what analysts have increasingly been terming the new Middle East Cold War has been vital to the existence of ISIS. While ISIS treats Raqqa, Syria, as its effective capital, as Martin alluded to, al-Qaeda in Iraq is indeed the seedbed made fertile from the United States deposing of Saddam Hussein and from which the distinct Sunni militancy of ISIS has most immediately grown. Ironically inheriting the mantle of Sunni Arab power in Baghdad that had been bestowed by Britain originally, Saddam's persecution of Shia and Kurds was highlighted by his attack on Iran in 1980, his infamous brutality against both Shia and Kurds during the resulting 8-year conflict, as well as following his 1991 Gulf War loss to the United States. Saddam's rapid fall, together with the U.S. purging of his Sunni Ba'athist compatriots, and post-Saddam Shi'i brutality having turned the tables on Sunnis in Iraq, has indeed created a hothouse for the cultivation of a vengeful and militarily powerful and capable ISIS. Today, as a supposedly less brutal Shi'i regime in Baghdad seeks to retake Iraqi territory from the would-be caliphate, it is difficult to see how a fight of this consequence would other than hinge on support from Baghdad's now patron Tehran. The question of what Canada might stand to gain by becoming further ensnared in this morass is difficult to answer, to be sure. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
One last question to you before we actually open it up to the broader community. In what ways is ISIS connected with the interventions of outside power inside Syria and Iraq right now?
So in what ways is it connected with powers specifically acting on those two countries rather than more generally regionally? Well, I think in a multitude of ways. For one thing, it depends on which powers you're talking about, because of course Syria and Iraq have become sites for proxy wars that are absolutely, and here maybe it's an ill-advised historical reference, but Byzantine in their complexity. That's perhaps a poor pun, but I didn't intend it that way. But I mean, above all, I think singling out particular powers, Iran stands out to me above all, and that's the reason I ended with it. Not least because there's very significant strategic wrangling between Iran and the United States right now over who should be able to exert its interventionist power the most in Iraq. So as the Iraqi government gears up for an attempt to retake Tikrit, perhaps in the future Mosul, there has been a decided engagement by Baghdad with Iran in favor over the United States. And I think arguably Iran has as much, perhaps more at stake strategically and ideologically than any other country in the neighborhood of Syria and Iraq. I'm also struck by Egypt, a country we haven't mentioned yet tonight, but of course Egypt, with respect to the supposed presence of ISIS in Libya, now stands as one of the major potential interventionist actors. Turkey, very significant. It has gotten cold feet recently because it now sees the arguably sort of Frankenstein's monster that its intervention in Syria has helped to create. But I also think very significant, and this is something where I was especially struck by some comments Scott was making in his presentation, thinking about the relationship between the domestic electoral cycle and a number of interventionist or potentially interventionist powers. I think of course, Canada, the United States, thinking of how the run-up to the 2016 election might affect decisions, whether by Hillary Clinton as a prospective Democratic candidate and perhaps Jeb Bush or some other Republican candidate. The fact that the non-interventionist Rand Paul seems to be out of the running, I think is potentially quite significant. And one more country that hasn't been mentioned tonight, other than very, very briefly, I think potentially significant is, of course, Israel. You know, you think of Prime Minister Netanyahu's address to the United States Congress a couple of days ago. Obviously, a country where there's a very active election cycle running up to an election 2 weeks from now. And while Israel has been assiduously, in certain respects, a non-interventionist power, albeit, there are various conspiracy theories about Israel supposedly working to foment dissension in the Islamic world that could keep everyone off balance. Conspiracy theories, I emphasize. But, again, thinking of Scott's presentation, the emphasis on securitization, through which Prime Minister Netanyahu legitimates his continuing administration, I think is a potentially significant factor to think about how Israel might imaginably get involved as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we have about half an hour or so for some conversation. There are 2 microphones on the edges of the room that can be moved around to people with their hands up, and we will take, who would like to go first? Why don't we start on this side? Yeah, we'll collect a few on this side. Is anybody? Oh, too late. This side is one out. Is that on? There we go. That's on. Sure. So we'll do 2, and then we'll answer the questions. Then we'll kind of go back. Now I'm going to ask both the speakers on both ends of the microphone to keep their questions and answers brief, so we can get as many in as possible.
It's not so much a question. I thank you very much for your excellent review of the history. Jewishly, of course, I'm aware of that. When it, in considering that 76% of pre-First War, World War Palestine was used to create Jordan. My concern is along other lines. One of the, Mr. Rippin, you briefly touched on the use of language, and my concern is basically a semantic one. And what I haven't heard addressed here this evening is something I consider to be a very serious failure in addressing concerns about ISIS. And whenever I hear the word Islamic State, I just cringe. And I can't imagine what it must be like for Muslims when they hear that, for true Muslims, when they hear that, because I'm at a loss to understand why political leaders, religious leaders, and the media are not using the term un-Islamic state, when clearly this is, the actions of these people are way beyond anything that can be described as Islamic.
Thank you. It's a good question.
It's not only that.
Oh. But there are other folks who need to get their question. That was a great one, though.
I just want to give you one little example of the use of language, which I think is very irresponsible.
Can it be brief?
Yeah, it's something that was in the Globe and Mail. Okay. It was an article on October 3rd by Robert Fowler, who's generally acknowledged to be quite an expert. And it's an article that says half measures in fight against Islamic State will only make matters worse. And he writes this. He says, at home, we would need to make very clear that we will not abide jihadi teaching, jihadi recruiting, or the dissemination of jihadi propaganda. Now, I'm asking, my question is, how usefully might his words have resonated if he had used some qualifiers, or some respectful qualifiers? What if he had said something along the lines, and I'm just throwing this out, we will not abide radically debased forms of jihadi teachings and recruiting, or the dissemination of misappropriated, knee-jerk, lesser jihadi propaganda, grossly misrepresented jihadi ideology, mistakenly imbalanced jihadist views.
Thank you.
That would give the young people who are at risk an opportunity who are not privileged to be instructed in what jihad really means and what prerequisites have to be met.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you. Now, that's a fairly full question. Is there another question close by? Thank you. Actually, yes.
I'm Michael Marr from Sadet. I got a question. I heard one mention of Saudi Arabia. It's the big elephant in the room, isn't it? It's the richest one. It's Sunni. It's been funding bombing attacks in Israel for years when their parents got some bonus. Do you really think that Saudi Arabia will let Sunnis be subjugated between Shiite, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and anyone else in the room?
Thank you. Good question. Gentlemen?
If I could,
yes,
is this on?
Yes.
To attempt to talk about that. So Muslims actually debate this particular issue a lot over how to talk about this sort of use of Islam in the Islamic State. And it's a complicated question. Because I don't, you run into the problem after all that they call themselves Muslim, they call themselves Islamic, and that on one level needs to be acknowledged, I suppose. But the issue is usually discussed in the way of saying a kind of distinction that comes up in Muslim language, that to say we don't need to acknowledge that these people are Muslim and that they claim to be so, but they certainly aren't very Islamic, and that's often a response which is given in this sort of way. That is, that they're not living up to the Islamic ethos that Muslims agree upon. But Muslim theology encourages the kind of approach to these sorts of questions that says, but God will have to decide in the end. So for an individual Muslim to judge a member of the Islamic State as a non-Muslim would be to fall into the trap that, in fact, the Islamic State is putting forth by declaring all other Muslims non-Muslims. And so you get yourself into that kind of twisted situation. So this is what is often referred to as takfir, so declaring somebody else to be a non-Muslim. And it's something which a vast majority of other Muslims won't do, because it's up to God to do that. Such people must be treated as Muslims, but one can certainly censure their activities, and Muslims definitely do that. So it's an issue which is extensively debated, that's for sure.
Does anybody want to tackle Saudi Arabia?
Sure. So I think your point is a very significant one, because I think Saudi Arabia is, in terms of the overall regional and global scheme, certainly one of the most significant actors here. And I think there are a few. It's also an actor that's in a very complex situation, not least because it has been undergoing its own succession change recently since the death of King Abdullah, and is very concerned about matters of internal as well as regional stability. And when I think of Saudi Arabia with respect to ISIS, certainly, there's been much condemnation that has been directed at the Saudis for playing this double game of, on the one hand, supposedly being part of a coalition against ISIS, but on the other hand, actively, supposedly working to actively foment a kind of ideology, whether one wants to call it Wahhabism or an offshoot of Wahhabism, that ultimately is drawn upon by an actor like ISIS. And when one thinks of Saudi Arabia here, I sometimes think of analogies to Pakistan, which also has been long caught in a very difficult double game of, on the one hand, seeking to use support for the Taliban as an offset against its strategic rivalry with India, analogous to Saudi Arabia seeking strategic offsets in its rivalry with Iran, but on the other hand, facing the possibility of destabilization at home. And I think when we look at the Saudi position right now, especially within the context of the Arab uprisings, especially given the Saudis having no toleration for religiously based dissent at home, and their very strong support for Egypt and its crushing of the Muslim Brotherhood right now, and especially in the light of the recent monarchical succession in Saudi Arabia, what I see Saudi Arabia as interested in, above all at the moment, is stability. And if necessary, through strict authoritarianism at home that tamps down increasingly, and this is a change we've been seeing within the Saudi security services approach to groups like ISIS, really tamping down on at least overt, active support for organizations like that right now, because stability comes above all. Domestically in Saudi Arabia right now, on my understanding in any event. But it does certainly remain one of the absolutely pivotal regional actors here that could tilt in any one of a number of different directions if circumstances domestically or internationally were to change somewhat.
Thank you, Mr. Martin.
Right. And to add to that, and to draw on earlier comments of Andrew, the proxy war that's going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I think in terms of diplomatic efforts to bring an end to this fighting, some thought to that very geopolitical rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia has to be dealt with as well.
Sorry, let's go back to this side. Yes, sir.
Is it going? Okay. I'm interested in two issues, separate issues. One is, what is the purpose, what should be the purpose of foreign, that is, in this case, Canada's intervention in the Middle East? And the second one is, what is the purpose of our government deliberately hollowing out Canadian democracy?
Let's pile up another question on the back. Where is the other mic? Oh, here it is. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think there are a few elephants in the room, and the one I'm going to bring up, and I hope I don't get tomatoes thrown at me or tomatoes, is Syria. Syria, I would posit, is the only country truly fighting ISIS. I think the West is playing at it, and there's no question about them fighting ISIS, whereas the moderate rebels or whoever the hell we think we're allying ourselves with over there, we don't really know who they are, which some of the gentlemen spoke to. And I think we should be seriously considering humbling ourselves and cooperating with Syria against ISIS. Now, of course, anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, two good questions. Go ahead. Scott?
Sure, I'll respond to the first on the purpose of Canada's intervention. I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. The first is Canada's interest in being seen as an active member of an international community that's unified against a particular threat. So it's not simply that Canada views ISIS as a threat, although I don't dismiss the fact that the current government actually views ISIS as a threat. But I think part of it is you have an international coalition. It's now over 60 states that are participating, and Canada has an interest in being seen on the world stage, active in response to this. So I think there's an international purpose behind it, which is to increase Canada's visibility internationally. And as I alluded to, I think there's a domestic purpose behind it too, which is strictly electioneering. Just if we can identify a certain segment of the population that will identify strongly with this issue and this type of response, then it's a potential way for the current government to hold on to power. As for the issue of hollowing out Canadian democracy, that's a much larger issue. I don't necessarily disagree with the assertion, but I think the purpose is ideological, which would require a panel of its own to really explore it. But
so diplomatic. Now there's a question on Syria. I don't know.
I want to briefly address it. Sure.
With respect to the question about Syria, you know, I'm not unsympathetic to the spirit of the first part of your comment. I was thinking I had the opportunity to participate in a panel last fall where a just retired Canadian military attaché had said publicly at that panel that he thinks that Canadians and others within the West should publicly apologize to Bashar al-Assad for destroying his country. I'm not sure that I would necessarily go that far. I do think that outside interventionism has made the situation immeasurably worse, but I do think a very important question that needs to be asked with respect to the second part of your question is whether Bashar al-Assad is indeed fighting ISIS as actively as he is fighting other elements of the opposition arrayed against him in the western half of the country. I mean, certainly this is a claim of those in many of those in the Syrian opposition, which is that Bashar al-Assad is all too happy to have ISIS in the eastern part of the country help to confer legitimacy on him and allow him to make the argument for why he is the only game in town, while continuing to bombard Daraa, Aleppo, places in the western portion of the country, which are not so much ISIS strongholds as strongholds of other portions of the opposition.
Thank you.
I'm not able to cite proof at this moment. I wouldn't claim to be able to have concrete proof, but just to put out there that is a possible argument as well, made by many within the Syrian opposition who certainly would have greater access to evidence than I.
Pardon?
And I've heard the same, that there are, say, the more nationalist or moderate Syrian forces fighting Assad feel quite betrayed by the fact that now the allies are siding with Assad against the the ISIS forces, and that allows Assad to turn more of his attention against the moderate forces because the allies are doing their dirty work against ISIS for him. And that weakens the strength and legitimacy of the other forces. I'd also follow up on this and suggest and completely agree that diplomacy over Syria and the transition is over Assad's transition, and the compromise and diplomacy over that has to be a key feature, in addition to the diplomacy between Iran and Saudi Arabia. One could think optimistically then about the opportunities that emerge here for bringing, at the very least, a ceasefire to the destructive civil war in Syria. I'd also think this is perhaps a good an opportunity to perhaps talk about the extent to which Canada could do more to support the millions of Syrian and Iraqi refugees outside of the countries, let alone the millions more who are internally displaced.
Now there's on this side. There's a question here, then the question in the front. And we'll stack them up.
Okay, sorry. I'd like to raise some issues about theological objections that have been raised in various media. I think the New York Times had a pretty good documentary on this, and I guess the sense is that they feel, anyway, that many or a great number of jihadist theorists are criticizing ISIS seriously, and they're calling it deviant, and its self-proclaimed caliphate null and void. And some of these people are actually very radical themselves. They're including Al-Qaeda-oriented and Saudi clerics. And some of them are Salafists and very, very critical of ISIS. So I guess my question is, we've heard of fatwas before, and they can be issued against anybody that a certain group of clerics feel is deviant. Cannot the religious leaders or some of these religious people with influence in the Middle East declare almost a holy war against ISIS? It seems to me a much cleaner way of cleaning things up than sending in troops on the ground from the West, which wouldn't work at all.
Thank you.
That's my question.
Good question. And this question?
My name is Adam Leuchter. My question is fairly simple and directed at Andrew Wender. What do you think the Middle East will look like 50 years from now?
Okay. Two big questions. Who wants to tackle it? Andrew, do you want to?
I'll try at least some points on the first one. The idea that the caliphate is null and void is an important one, because at least the discussions over it go in terms of the necessity of holding control over land is the only thing which can legitimate a caliph's position in that sense, which is one of the reasons why the Islamic State has put such a lot of emphasis upon controlling territory and so forth. But the point is that certainly the other jihadi groups have certainly haven't aligned themselves with the Islamic State, and it comes there. I don't think looking at that in theological terms certainly helps there. So the differences there between, say, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State that this really is a more political issue which is emerging there. The sense in which the context back in Iraq has set these two groups at each other in a certain way. I suppose you know declaring holy war against the Islamic State might sound good, but once again, it's. I think many Muslims would view that as simply aggravating the problem, to sort of to acknowledge it in that particular way. Muslims have, certainly Muslim leaders have spoken out very powerfully. The most significant one was sort of the argument in what was called the Letter to al-Baghdadi, arguing on religious grounds, on doctrinal grounds for the errors of the sorts of things which they were putting forth, and it was signed by a large number of Muslim leaders from around the world. It doesn't, in that sense, end up being particularly effective because the religion clearly isn't the only thing which is going on, as our other panelists have made quite clear.
Thank you for your very provocative question. I will not advance a prognostication that would probably be proven foolish next week, let alone 50 years from now. But I will address it with a factor that I think is especially significant. And I hope you won't find this to be a cop-out, because I think it's the best I can do. I'd like to pick up on something that Martin said in his presentation, which I was really struck by, and it's something that people have been emphasizing a lot, especially people within Syria and Iraq who still consider themselves to be nationalists within those countries. Not necessarily supporters of regimes, but they think of their identity as Syrian or Iraqi. And this was something that also came up in an ISIS discussion we were doing in the history department at UVic last fall. And it's this. While there are so many dimensions of modern nation states like Syria and Iraq, which are perhaps artificial, are perhaps derived from colonial malfeasance or colonial map makers drawing lines on maps or on paper or what have you, I really do agree with something Martin said, which is that Sykes-Picot is 100 years ago. And there have come forth generations of people who do genuinely think of themselves as Syrian, as Iraqis, and actually quite resent prognostications which, you know, presume to say, the era of the nation state in the Middle East is over. And there, for example, was an influential piece in the New York Times in September of 2013 by the Middle East commentator Robin Wright that was much discussed. And she said, I think what we may see is that the Middle East is now going to be redrawn into these horizontal strips, split along communal lines of religious and cultural and ethnic identification. And there was a very strong pushback to that from some of the sorts of nationalists whom Martin is alluding to, who said, wait a second, please be careful before you presume in New York City to write off this country of which I am a member and which I envision in my particular way. Not necessarily a regime-sanctioned way, but in my particular way. So I think while we may be living in an age of the waning nation state, we're also living in an age of nation states which are hanging on and which may be seeking to reconfigure themselves, sometimes through very brutal power, sometimes through courageous initiatives. But whether it will be a Middle East without the nation states that we recognize today in 50 years, I don't know. I think that the emphasis Martin placed on these multiple generations of people with meaningful national identity is something that has to be taken seriously.
So you're underlining what Benedict Anderson would have said, that these are imagined communities, yes, but they are still communities.
Absolutely. Great way of putting it.
So unfortunately, we're running up to the end of time. We do have two people who I've already acknowledged in the question queue. There was a gentleman back there in the sweater, and then a woman in the front with this other sweater. Everybody's wearing sweaters. It's Victoria. What am I going to do?
Hi, I'm just wondering what you think would happen. Let's just say by some miracle, all outside intervention stopped next week in the Middle East. What do you think, how do you see the region working out its problems, and to what degree would there be war, and would it be peaceful, would it be quite horrific, and could the West really stand back and watch it happen if it were turned to be something like what was happening in Syria, but on a much grander scale?
Thank you. That's a great question. Now, there's the fellow in the blue sweater. Thanks, Naz. You get the final question.
Actually, I was going to ask a similar question to that, which leads to another question. Let's assume that Canada decided, as it did in the Iraq War, we're not in this. And because this panel here is now deciding, I hope, could send some light, what should we do? What should Canada do? And my friend down here said, well, what if we all just bugged out of this thing? What would happen if we did?
That's a very good way to end the questions from you folks. Now we have, the panel has an opportunity to address those two difficult but provocative questions. No one wants to do it. Everyone's pointing. You do it. You're the director. You do it.
I'll go first so you'll forget about what I say and listen to Andrew. So what I usually say here is that I'm in the history department, so I don't have to, I have no magic ball to look in. No, but there are two very important points here, which I think do need to be underlined. One is the question of foreign intervention, the whole issue of leaving this place alone. Right? You just go back 100 years, as Andrew, the 100 years that Andrew took us through, you're probably not going to find a part of the world that has been as intervened upon as this part of the world. Right? Whether that be through European imperialism or Cold War politics, the whole question of oil, and now it's around oil pipelines and transit links, et cetera, et cetera. None of that to the benefit of the population, and none of that lost on the population in terms of a history of intervention and betrayal and meddling. So whatever emerges, and I'll leave it at this, whatever does emerge from the region, it has to, for the region, it has to emerge from the region. Right? So in a sense, there's no, and I think it comes back to Scott's point too, there's no right answer here, I don't think, in terms of a planning process where there's going to be a known success or result at it, in terms of what, how these borders ought to look. But rather, it will emerge from as best as possible, the designs and interests of the individuals who live there.
Gentlemen?
Okay. I'll have a few things to say, but I'll keep it short. I think there's a couple of ways we can look at it. One in which Martin already brought up, which is the potential to support those who are fleeing the region. Canada's response to refugees so far has been abysmal. And picking up on the theological theme, the Canadian government's position at one point was that we should bring in more of the Christian refugee population from Syria. It was an explicitly religious provocation over which groups should be brought into Canada. Now, it has subsequently backed off strongly that position, but I think it's still there. And it feeds into the rhetoric that's going on in which Islam has become the focus and the potential threat in Canada. So for Canada, if you're bringing in refugees, that you would focus on the Christian population, viewed as less threatening. I think if there's one thing that comes out of the panel, is not necessarily to answer the question what we can do in the Middle East. I'm more interested in what we can do in Canada to influence policies internally and our actions in the Middle East. I think there could be a potential role for Canada to play, but it has to be following a lead of local actors and how they see regional solutions, and Canada could be part of that. The last thing I would do is to provocate just a little bit, in which a couple panelists have argued that nationalist identities persist, but I think less than 30 years ago, people were saying that about Yugoslavia, that there was a strong sense of Yugoslavian nationalist identity, and it crumbled very quickly, and there's no strong movement now necessarily to resurrect Yugoslavia. And I think we could see a similar type of dissolution where, yes, there were some people saying we need to keep Yugoslavia, but has subsequently broken down. That could be an outcome in this case.
Andrew?
Much as I said when I responded to the lady over on the left, I am very sympathetic to the spirit of each of your questions. And I think that it especially comes to the fore when you engage with the profound human struggle of realizing that people are dying and living in a state of tremendous torment. And it is this very real and appropriate human impulse to ask, what can I do? But I have to say that I find what Martin and Scott have just said to be very provocative, very compelling, and I'd like to add maybe one or two other things in terms of perhaps underscoring in a particular way what they've said. I think, for one thing, there cannot be intervention of any sort, but especially military intervention, without an extremely careful thinking through, not subject to bombastic rhetoric, for example, about what the actual national interest of a particular intervener is. So what does Canada have at stake in terms of its national interest within these borders in the fight against ISIS? I'm not presuming that I know the answer to that question, but I think it is a question that needs to be addressed very significantly, because intervening on the basis of national interest is a very different kind of thing than intervening, say, on the basis of humanitarianism. And I would defer to Scott for his knowledge on the tremendous complexities of humanitarian intervention, but just suffice to say that that is one of the most fraught forms of interventionism in recent global history, not least because of the accusation, which certainly appears to have some merit, that it becomes a kind of thinly veiled cover for raw geostrategic interest, which gussies itself up as genuine humanitarianism. So I think before interventionism is undertaken of any sort, and there may indeed be forms of intervention where Canada can be productive, as in providing support for millions of displaced people, but I think a very, very careful analysis needs to be engaged democratically about what really is at stake for Canada in this conflict, as opposed to particular kinds of ideals that might sound tremendously appealing, and to which I might have tremendous sympathy. But at the end of the day, whether humanity is really furthered becomes a question that may not turn out the way one wishes it to when you first look at the state of affairs.
Okay. So it is now my great pleasure and honor to be able to wrap this evening up, and I want to do so with a number of thank yous. First and foremost, of course, to the panelists. We're dealing with subjects that are so complex, in the case of the Middle East, subject to a long history of prejudice and pre-assumptions. And in the case of Canada, information that is not particularly transparent or as accountable as we would like it to be. So I really want to thank all of the panelists for bringing such clarity to this complex situation. Secondly, to Paul for doing such a wonderful job moderating this. Thirdly, we'll be a big opportunity for applause at the end. To the staff of the CFG Center for Global Studies, and in particular Jody Walsh and Chris and Brittany, who helped bring this about and also helped with the microphones. Also to thank the IdeaFest people at UVic and all of this too. Finally, to thank all of you for coming to listen to this as well. There's clearly a real sort of thirst for more knowledge. I'd ask and invite you to put your name and email down on a sign-up sheet so that you can stay in touch with the various events that the Center for Global Studies and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society put on. We have very good websites that highlight all of that. And also there is a survey form which we ask you to fill out. And so we hope to be able to offer many more panels, bringing more voices and more expertise to this subject. So thank you very much, all of you, for participating.